Sentencing for murder is an emotionally explosive area.
If life meant life, we'd all be a heck of a lot safer.
For many, life should mean forever. And not so long ago in New Zealand, it did. Over the past 25 years, the murder rate in New Zealand has remained steady. Yet the number of lifers in prison has increased. This is because people are being held in prison for longer than ever before.
We have very high rates of incarceration, but they haven't delivered what they were supposed to deliver.
It's senseless having crushing sentences that crush, that give people no hope.
If you're going to accept a level of crime and give a pathetic sentence for it, then you're going to get more of those crimes, in my opinion.
This series looks at why and how this has happened through the cases that shocked the nation.
Yeah, you want a good look?
We talk to the country's leading legal experts and lawmakers, the insiders, revealing what they really think about how to punish killers. We track the people campaigning for even harsher sentences. We hear from the families of murder victims and speak with murderers.
Today's a huge day for my client Andrew Nicholson because today he's being sentenced for murder. He doesn't know how long he's going to actually spend in jail. Of course, he has to spend time in jail, he knows that, but it's the number of years, and that's what's going to be playing on his mind and has been playing on his mind since his conviction.
It's been nearly 3 years since Andrew Nicholson and Grant Cuthers killed Lee McMurdo in a drug deal that went wrong. It's now 4 months since the pair were convicted of murder in the High Court.
There is this suggestion that Mr. Nicholson is a henchman, a violent thug. He's got no violent history. There is a minimum non-parole that has to be applied, but not 17 years.
Well, it used to be the case that someone would simply be sentenced on the spot to life imprisonment with that minimum term of 10 years. Now it's a delayed process. We go to a sentencing date, reports are prepared, we have to file submissions dealing with what the minimum period of imprisonment should be. No individual, even though they've been convicted of murder, they don't know what that means for them at that particular point.
In 2002, New Zealand's sentencing laws for murder changed. Less than 60 years ago, the punishment was much simpler. Today, Andrew's facing a sentence of at least 17 years or more behind bars. How we punish those who kill has changed radically. Why? In this episode, we look back at 4 cases that shocked the nation and changed the course of our sentencing history. And we meet Dr. Paul Wood, who reveals what it's really like to be punished for murder.
You killed your drug dealer.
Yes.
Paul Wood killed a man when he was 18 years old. Today, he's a successful psychologist living on probation in central Auckland. 60 years ago, his fate would have been very different.
It's actually a judge's black cap, which was worn by a judge when we're delivering a sentence of capital punishment. Sir Graham Spate prosecuted 3 before the death penalty was finally lifted. But I think of those, one in particular did trouble him, and that was the Tafew case.
Like Paul Wood, Edward Tafew was a desperate and troubled youth when he was convicted of murder. Today, Edward Tafew is buried at Waikumete Cemetery. Graveyard historian Matthew Gray takes regular and popular public tours here, but Edward Tafew's grave does not have a headstone or marker.
We're in a Roman Catholic section of the cemetery. Edward lies in an unmarked grave. Tafew's defence argued in court that he killed Florence Smith out of panic, having been discovered doing what he was doing.
The main factor against it was the coroner's report that she had died of strangulation and that it was likely that he had strangled her after he had punched her.
Edward Tafew placed his hands around an old woman's neck and strangled the life out of her. To me, that is indeed a cold-blooded act.
The last Maori man to be hanged in New Zealand, Edward Tafew's sentence was so disturbing, it changed history.
Edward Tefew was born in Northland in 1935. There were 12 children in the family. Most of his older siblings resorted to a life of crime quite early on. It was common for him at the age of 6 to shoplift food to feed himself and the younger siblings at home. As he got older, Edward hung out at the racetracks and the saloons, and he was heavily into gambling. Now, on Anzac Day, he decided to drift to a little place called Ngāra Rotatuna. When he arrived there, he had no money. He was cold and hungry. He happened upon a cottage, which he knew the resident there was an elderly, widowed woman, 75-year-old Florence Smith.
He waited outside the house until the lights went out, so he knew there was someone in the house.
And then he broke in and he went from room to room. When he opened the door to Florence's bedroom, she turned the light on, and he went over and just punched the living lights out of her until she was unconscious.
Plainly, he attacked her very, very severely, and severely enough, obviously, to cause her death.
He stayed in her room and went through her belongings and took whatever valuables he could find. But instead of hightailing it out of there,
he helped himself to things in the fridge.
Made himself a cup of tea, boiled some eggs. Edward remained in Florence's cottage until about dawn, and then he hightailed it out of there. When he was arrested, he spilled his guts and broke down and confessed to everything. When the police told him that she was found with horrific head injuries, his comment was, "I must have hit her more times than I intended."
A young Māori male who was deserving of the conviction for murder, but whether the penalty, which was death by hanging, was the right thing.
He was a very, very simple young man who found God in his last days in that prison cell. In his mind, he was about to meet Jesus.
Tefu was feeble-minded. I understand likeable, but feeble-minded. Maybe there was what you might call diminished responsibility.
Peter Williams is one of the country's toughest and most respected defence lawyers. He was there the morning of Edward Tefew's hanging.
I was a member of the Howard League in those days. We were very anti the death penalty. The night of the hanging, we met outside the prison walls.
The prisoner would be weighed, and also they'd take note of his build. If the drop was too short, the neck wouldn't break, and the culprit would hang there strangling. If the drop was too long, there was a danger that the head would come right off and there'd be blood everywhere. A couple of Eddie Tefew's brothers were in Mount Eden prison at the time. The family were outside the prison walls wailing.
Waiata filled the entire prison.
The condemned man was taken up, a rope put around his neck, and the officer consigned to the duty would pull the lever and the trapdoors would open.
I can remember in the morning we were told he was dead. I know many people who attended hangings never got over it, the shocking spectacle.
The great poet James K. Baxter penned a few lines and he called them a rope for Harry Fat. The butcher boy and the baker boy were whistling in the street when the hangman bound Tefew's eyes and strapped his hands and feet, who stole to buy a bicycle and killed in panic blood. The parson won his soul at length, said Harry Fat the good. Oh, some will kill in rage and fear, and some will kill in hate, and some will kill on foreign lands to serve the master state. Justice walks heavy in the land, she bears a rope and shroud. We will not change our policy, said Harry Fat the proud.
The hanging of a young man who was quite possibly mentally challenged shocked many in New Zealand. Throughout the 1950s, anti-capital punishment sentiment began to grow.
People became, I think, conscience-stricken. Human beings don't like people to plan a murder. It's a far more vicious murder if it's planned in detail. When you draw the parallel with a hanging, it's very planned, isn't it? And here is the state being violent in the most extreme way to an individual who has no protection.
The last man to be hanged in New Zealand was Whanganui farmer Walter Bolton. sentenced to death for poisoning his wife with arsenic. After the trial, traces of arsenic were found in the farm water supply, casting a new light on Bolton's conviction. But the new evidence came too late.
The death penalty is a very hazardous undertaking because you can't repair it once it's been done.
As a university student, former Minister of Justice and New Zealand's 33rd Prime Minister, Sir Geoffrey Palmer, witnessed the abolition of the death penalty in 1962.
There are not only legal arguments against it, there are very strong moral arguments against it. It doesn't seem to me that it is compatible with the sort of attitudes that modern social democracies have.
The death penalty as punishment for murder was replaced by life imprisonment with a fixed 7 years jail time. But New Zealand was changing fast, and our new liberal approach was about to collide with 60s counterculture and an explosive criminal underworld. 3 weeks before Christmas in 1963, a landlord marches into his villa on Bassett Road in Auckland. Inside, he finds his 2 tenants sprawled on blood-splattered mattresses riddled with machine gun bullets. This gangster-style execution became known as the Bassett Road machine gun murders. And just 2 years after capital punishment was abolished, we suddenly felt unsafe in our own country.
This was our first big gangland murder. It was pretty big time.
In the early 1960s, punishment for murder had changed from the brutal penalty of hanging to a life sentence with at least 7 years behind bars before any chance of release. Urban population was on the rise. Auckland was rife with illegal beer houses, petty crime and gambling rings. Efforts to control the dangerous criminal subculture would shape the rest of the decade and mark the start of a growing desire for harsher sentences. The 50th anniversary of the murders has reunited key players for the first time. At crime writer Scott Bainbridge's book launch, they're discussing what really happened that night on Bassett Road.
A double murder in a beer house with a submachine gun, which was scandalous for the day.
They were all stoned and full of rum. Ill comes of what in play began. Now, I want to talk about Ron Jorgensen because he and I were very close. I am certain in my mind that he had no felonious intent.
For defence lawyer and Queen's Counsel Peter Williams, this was a defining moment for New Zealand's justice system. As a young lawyer, he saw the reality behind the headlines, representing one of the so-called gangsters, Ron Jorgensen.
Jorgensen became a sort of a character in his own day, and he had to live up to it. The tough guy. The real man actually was a very sensitive, artistic person.
Jorgensen had been born in Kaikoura. His mum died when he was reasonably young. He started committing petty offences.
Through the Borstals, through the jails, became hardened.
It was in Borstal Ron Jorgensen formed a friendship with young criminal John Gillies.
Gillies committed a number of serious offences: violence, aggravated robbery, assault. There's also a question about his mental frame of mind. People have referred to him as being quite a psycho.
In 1960, Gillies went to Australia where he became entrenched in a criminal lifestyle.
He was caught during an aggravated burglary and sentenced to 3 years in Pentridge Prison, which was the toughest prison in Australia.
By 1963, Ron Jorgensen was married and settled in Auckland, running a lucrative sly grog operation. 6 o'clock closing meant the sale of liquor was illegal after 6 p.m. Anna Hoffman was a close friend of one of the Bassett Road victims.
A sly grog was like a drinking establishment. It was fly-by-night sometimes. Somebody could rent a house, set it up a little bit. You would go there after the hotel closed at 6 o'clock and you could buy this beer.
Having done his time in Australia, Gillies heard of Jorgensen's success and made his way to Auckland with high hopes.
He'd come to Auckland with this idea that he was going to be the big note, who was going to carry out all these crimes and be seen as the Mr. Big. Probably to Jorgensen's surprise, Gillies turned up on the doorstep one day and said, "Can you lend me some money and put me up for a while?"
Gillies attached himself to Jorgensen's beer house operation. When a disagreement erupted with a beer house across town, Gillies put his hand up as a thug for hire.
Gillies produced a leather case and produced a submachine gun and said, I'll deal to him.
According to police records, Jorgensen was sent along that night to make sure Gillies finished the job.
Dave drove to 115 Bassett Road, knocked on the door. Kevin Spate came to the door in his pyjamas. Gillies had produced the gun, saying, I'm going to kill you. In the meantime, George Walker, who was asleep in the next room, was wondering what all the commotion was about and was ushered into the room. Gillies opened fire on Kevin Spate.
They just made George kneel down and shot him in the back.
And it was a few days after that Eric Lewis, who had recently tenanted his house out to 2 salesmen, went along to collect the rent and found 2 dead bodies.
Gillies was quickly taken into custody. Jorgensen was arrested soon after. Public pressure demanded swift justice.
It must have been a shock to the New Zealand public to wake up and read Chicago comes to Auckland, machine gun murder.
To this day, Peter Williams believes because Jorgensen didn't pull the trigger, he shouldn't have been charged with murder.
It's still open to argument that Jorgensen was wrongly convicted.
In keeping with the criminal code, the 2 men refused to give testimony, so both men were charged with murder.
The Crown prosecutors were confident they had a watertight case against Gillies, but the evidence against Jorgensen was absolutely flimsy.
We tried to sever, we made application to sever them, to have them tried separately, but because they said it was a joint venture.
Both were convicted and received the new life sentence with 7 years minimum prison time.
In Jorgensen's case, he's lucky that New Zealand had abolished the death penalty. Both men would have gone to the gallows.
They did that to a friend of mine, and I don't care what happens to them, really.
In 1965, John Gillies wrote an open letter claiming sole responsibility for the Bassett Road murders. Although eligible for parole after 7 years, he was considered too high a risk for long-term release and has spent almost his entire adult life behind bars.
Life imprisonment effectively means that someone is subject to the sentence for the rest of their life. Doesn't mean they necessarily stay in prison, but it means that they can be recalled to prison at any time.
Jorgensen continued to protest his innocence and was first paroled after 11 years in prison.
Where someone is convicted of life imprisonment and is released, they are released on parole. Now what that means is that there are conditions which they must adhere to for the rest of their life.
For Jorgensen, these strict parole conditions proved too much. In 1984, Jorgensen's car left the road on the rugged Kaikoura coast and his body was never found.
He felt he'd lost his way in life, he hadn't had a family or anything like that, and he was deeply depressed. In the end, he committed suicide. That's a very definite opinion.
The 1961 penalty of a life sentence with at least 7 years prison time for murder was held by most to be working effectively. As in the case of John Gillies, a life sentence could keep a criminal behind bars for their whole adult life. But new upheavals in the 1980s were about to bring sentencing into public debate once more.
Very early in the 80s was the Springbok tour, which was a seminal moment in New Zealand's history and tore the country in half, followed by the move towards a market economy.
There'd been a number of horrific sort of crimes that had captured the public attention, as they always do.
Increasing loss of these sort of old values that made people feel safe.
In 1986, there was a big series of advertisements in the New Zealand Herald and the Christchurch Press, full-page advertisements, all about rape, murder and mayhem. These advertisements excited public opinion. I got a tremendous amount of mail about this as Minister of Justice.
Law and order is an issue that enables governments to show that they're in control and being strong. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a recurring election issue.
It's become a triennial auction. In the run-up to the 1987 election, national opposition were campaigning fairly strongly on things like restoring the death penalty.
In 1985, the Crimes Act was amended and the compulsory prison time for murderers was increased from 7 to 10 years. But for some, this wasn't enough, and those who campaigned for tougher punishments argued prisons had become more like hotels.
Prison's too easy, it's too soft. You get treated with luxuries, televisions and heated floors in some, etc., etc. You say?
The tough part of prison is the company you keep. I mean, imagine being housed with all of the worst bullies and most annoying people from school, but there's no home time. And then add to that the complete inability to make adult decisions for yourself.
Dr. Paul Wood has a unique insight into the realities of prison life.
You killed your drug dealer.
Yes.
In the 1990s, punishment for murder was a life sentence with a minimum of 10 years imprisonment before any chance of parole. Until a fateful night in 1995, Dr. Paul Wood wouldn't have found this relevant to him.
Through his experience in prison, Paul became aware of the fundamental issues that people face when trying to create real change. What's Your Prison is a unique personal development approach created by Dr. Paul Wood that helps people identify and break out of their mental prisons. Paul Wood, good morning.
Good morning.
Let me go back to you when you were 18. You were off the planet. You killed your drug dealer. Explain your state of mind.
By the time of the offending, I was just constantly wasted.
What drugs?
At that stage, morphine mainly, intravenously shooting that up.
After the break, I want to get on to the changes that you made and that you are now helping other people make.
How did Paul Wood go from teenage killer to doctor of psychology? And what's it really like to be sentenced to life in prison?
I came from a nuclear family, loving family, but around the age of 12, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. It wasn't something I found easy to deal with.
There's 4 boys in the family, and like Paul's the closest age to me, and he's my older brother, so I looked up to him. Paul maybe in some respects sheltered me from the bad stuff he was up to. I mean, I didn't really know he was getting into drugs heavily.
By the time I was 18, I was pretty seriously involved in a criminal lifestyle. I had dropped out of school. When my mother passed away when I was 18, I was just quite devastated by that. And 2 days later, I made a decision to catch up with a drug dealer.
That night, Boyd Bevan, a well-known drug dealer in the Wellington area, came to Paul's flat and offered him a deal.
Boyd's like, I've been giving you all these cheap deals, you owe me. And Paul was like, what do you mean? And then Paul's obviously like, no, well, I can't pay you. So Boyd says to Paul, maybe we can work something out. If you and Tracy, have sex on the couch in front of me, then, I can let it slide. Paul was like, there's no chance she's going to go for that. That's where Boyd sort of said, don't worry about it. Me and you can just have some fun. And that's when he made an advance on Paul. And then that's when the scuffle started and they started fighting.
The struggle quickly escalated into a brutal fight for survival, and Paul completely lost control.
I don't think he intended to kill him. I don't think that was the case, but he beat him up and he died.
Alerted by neighbours, police were on the scene quickly to take Paul into custody. Paul missed his mother's funeral because he was sitting in a remand cell awaiting trial for murder.
As you would walk through this wing, once you'd been remanded in custody, people would start kicking those steel doors and they would yell out, "Kill yourself! Hang yourself! I'm gonna fucking get you tomorrow!" and stuff like that. And man, that's your welcoming, you know where you are. I was accused of acting with careless disregard, which I should have known would result in death without sufficient provocation, which is sort of like a subclause of murder in New Zealand. After a long deliberation, I was found guilty of murder rather than manslaughter. Mandatory sentence at that point, 10 years to life. So that means you have to serve a minimum of 10 years before you become eligible for parole. It doesn't mean you get out after 10 years. It means you serve 10 years, then you start going to the parole board, and the parole board makes decisions on your suitability for release.
Mum had just died, and then I just lost my brother, you know? Like, he's getting a life sentence.
I remember going back to the prison and thinking, this is my new life now. I need to forget about the outside world. I need to just focus on this now. This is my new life. In higher security, people will back up. So if you have a fight and you lose, the expectation will be that you'll tool up and get a shank or a knife and seek retribution. And if you don't, then, you know, that's seen as a real sign of weakness. In my early years, when he used to come and visit me, and I'd be on like non-contact booth visits through the glass on the telephone, and I'd have black eyes and stuff. I came across a guy in Maxie. We were in the yard one day. He had a heavy metal ashtray, I think it used to be a carb head or something of a car, and a tennis ball, and said to me, if I drop these at the same time, which will hit the ground first? And I remember thinking, what a stupid question. The heavier one, of course. So he drops these things at the same time. They hit the ground at the same time. And it was like a magic trick for me. The world, you know, might be more than I've previously considered it to be. There are a lot of people as well in prison who were just a nightmare to deal with. And that really got me interested in the complexity of human behaviour. That's when I started getting interested in psychology.
Paul discovered he could study university papers inside prison.
I was, I think, about 3 or 4 years into my sentence. I did these 2 papers through Massey. I remember writing this assignment, all as a single paragraph, all in capital letters, because I didn't know what a paragraph or anything was or what sentences were. I didn't really get any of that. And I thought it looked neater in capital letters. And I remember I was in a punishment block for drug users at the time when I finished those first 2 papers. And I passed them. You know, I was so blown away that I had passed university-level papers. I thought to myself, imagine if I could get out of here with a degree.
You did a bachelor's and a master's in psychology in prison. This is my prescription for prisoners. Hard labour from breakfast to lunch. After lunch, you have plenty of rehabilitation available, and you say...
The key thing is, whatever decisions we make are based on what we hope to get out of it, and they're in line with the research around that. If we want more punishment, fine, but we need to be honest, that's not going to result in rehabilitation or lower reoffending.
Great pleasure talking to you, thank you.
Thank you. Real pleasure talking with you.
Paul is serving his life sentence on probation. He works as a clinical psychologist, life coach, and mentors at-risk youth.
The longer you leave people in prison, the less likely it is you'll be able to let them out because they are not capable of re-socialisation in the community after a long period of time.
To give someone no hope, that's just wrong. People definitely can change. In my mind, if they had that thing where it was, okay, you've murdered someone, that's the end of your life, there's no release for you ever, I don't think he would have studied or been able to turn his life around, because what would there have been to hope for?
The mandatory 10 years prison time meant Paul was punished for his crime, but left hope for rehabilitation. But by the late 90s, the focus of sentencing had begun to shift. Calls for tougher and longer sentences would reach fever pitch as news broke of the horrifying murder of Beverly Bomer.
What happened to Mrs. Bomer and her husband represents what is probably most couples' worst nightmare.
For nearly 40 years in New Zealand, the sentence for murder had been the same: life imprisonment with a mandatory 7 or 10 years behind bars. But in 1998, a terrifying case would change all of this.
Get on your back, bitch, or I'll shoot you between the legs.
And mark the start of sweeping changes in our sentencing laws.
You had this lovely couple living a good life with their family, and having some offenders come in and take what's nearest and dearest away from them in a split second.
The term home invasion was a new one, and forever after was a phrase that would be the stuff of nightmares for all New Zealanders. Former homicide detective Chris McLeod remembers the horror to this day.
Kaingaroa was a flourishing little timber town, But as things became more automated, the work dropped away. Some people tried to stay there. The gangs got established. A lot of the houses become completely derelict. Right, we're in the heart of Reparar. Now this lovely little farming community. About 15 k's away you've got Kaingaroa, and there's a back road into Reparar. These offenders have come through that back road. We're just approaching the Boma's homestead. It's now not occupied by the Boma family. It was a Saturday afternoon that these 4 boys from Kaingaroa decided to go on a bit of a crime spree. David Pomako, known as Blue, was sort of the leader of the pack. Dylan Hitawa, a year or so younger. And they had these 2 juvenile boys who decided they were going to come along for the ride. In the early evening of the Saturday evening, they spied the Boma's house. They hid around the house, looking in through the window, and established there was only 2 people home, Henk and Beverly Boma. They'd already got a firearm from an associate. The house was unlocked. They stormed into the main living area, pointed the firearm at them and tied them up. They were looking to get hold of the Boma's money cards, hold them hostage, go and empty their bank accounts, then let them go. Blue decided that he was going to move Beverly into the master bedroom. She was sort of compliant initially, and we can see from her garment that it was ripped.
Get on the floor, bitch. Get on your back, bitch. I'll shoot you between the legs.
As best we can ascertain, she's gone to resist, and then he's pulled the trigger.
And then a horrific scream from Bev.
He shot her in the chest, and that's clipped the main artery to her heart. They had children, good salt of the earth, hard-working people. They were loved by the rest of their community. Detective Inspector Bell was given the job of running the investigation.
What happened to Mrs. Boma and her husband represents what is probably most couples' worst nightmare.
Sent shivers through the whole community out there, in fact the whole country. I was running the drug squad at the time. We went and touched base with a number of people. One of those sources came to me and said, these are the offenders. 6 days after the investigation started, we were able to mount a big police team. A team of about 60-odd police. We had the Eagle helicopter come down as well. Dog handlers, we had armed offenders. We certainly needed the numbers to take control of the situation. There were 4 offenders and their family that were supporting the offenders.
Why am I keeping it quiet?
You are the suspect for the murder of Mrs.
Shit. Hey, I beg your pardon?
You heard what I said. I said that this man, we believe that this man murdered Mrs. Boma.
Blue chose to say nothing. The others, because they were in a stronger position and they hadn't pulled the trigger, they knew that he was the one that shot poor Beverly. The law is that if you go with a common intention to commit a serious crime, you're a party to what takes place. There is a natural consequence that if someone's got a loaded firearm, that someone may get shot and someone may die. We really needed the evidence of those 3 other co-offenders against Blue to secure that conviction. So it was vitally important that we charged all 4 with murder.
Blue pleaded guilty to murder. The Crown then offered manslaughter and said if there are guilty pleas to manslaughter, they wouldn't pursue the murder charge, and all 3 remaining accused pleaded to the manslaughter.
Just relieved that it's over. That's all I really want to say at the moment.
Meanwhile, media coverage and the fear of home invasion was reaching fever pitch.
Home invasions, so-called, a term we didn't previously even recognise in New Zealand until the media started to talk about it.
Now Justice Minister Sir Douglas Graham is seeking an urgent review of penalties for these crimes.
The sanctity of somebody's home is precious, and we ought to respond if that's being abused, and it is.
A law change was rushed through Parliament. Anyone found guilty of a home invasion crime would receive an extra 3 years inside.
It had specifically introduced as an aggravating feature home invasion.
Blue Pomako was sentenced to life with 13 years non-parole. This law change was part of a sequence of events that would change the entire landscape of sentencing for murder in New Zealand. Napier farmer Garth McVicker decided it was time to make a stand and speak out on behalf of victims.
Because I'm going to have a protest.
By 1999, even bigger changes to New Zealand's sentencing laws were in the wind. The murder rate had remained steady throughout the last 25 years, and we had had the same sentencing laws for nearly 40 years, but a number of very violent cases were making us scared.
In the last month, there's been a spate of violent home invasions in the North Island.
The sentences aren't sort of deterring them for doing what they're doing.
I think there should be tougher sentences all round.
This fear made it into our sentencing laws and still affects us today.
This brings me to the sentence to be imposed in the most serious charge, namely that of murder.
Napier farmer Garth McVicker found himself troubled by the terrible story of Beverly and her husband Henk.
Hank was a farmer, I'm a farmer. I could sympathise with Hank. You know, he was tied up in a room next door and heard his wife screaming and then heard the shot. I couldn't understand why, you know, we didn't have millions of people on the street that day.
Dissatisfied with the sentences for a number of high-profile murders, Garth decided to take matters into his own hands. A powerful lobby group, Sensible Sentencing Trust, was born.
So I'm going to have a protest, and we organised a protest outside every courthouse in New Zealand.
The general fear and anger of the 80s and 90s finally had a voice, calling for tougher punishments and longer sentences.
There were a number of organisations before us. They tried to stand up. They got worn down by the system. I'm just a passionate Kiwi who happens to be in a fortunate position because I worked hard enough to stand up for the country that I love. We should probably bring those lawyers together again and say, OK, guys, we can't accept this. Where do we go with it? Some of the things I say are fairly provocative. I wanted to get people off the fence. The problem in New Zealand was that too many people were apathetic and not getting involved in this debate. So some of the things we did and said were to get people off the fence, and obviously the results speak for themselves.
They talk in slogans that never represent the realities and the complexities of the problems we're dealing with.
All we were doing was saying, we think you got it wrong. We think we need to have a debate around this, and sentencing and prison and courts and judges play a role in that, and so do victims. And we believe they should be right at the centre of the process.
There's no doubt that they have affected public opinion. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. And they put the spotlight on the victim, and that's a very emotional thing.
Another member of the public, Norm Withers, began campaigning at this time for tougher sentences following a violent assault on his mother.
We've got 170 in hand, so we simply need about 80,000 signatures.
Bringing more than 250,000 signatures on his petition to Parliament forced a referendum in 1999.
People's intolerance of violent crime, of home invasions, of course, will no doubt be assisting that extraordinary vote in that referendum, and any government elected would ignore that at their peril, perhaps.
The referendum itself was most unsatisfactory because it asked the public 3 quite different questions with a single answer, so it should never have been permitted.
As New Zealand voted yes, several examples of extreme violence hit the headlines.
If they were put in jail, we threw away the key and they never reappeared, I wouldn't lose a night's sleep.
Finally, the government responded with the sweeping 2002 Sentencing Act.
I was the Deputy Secretary for Justice at the time, and therefore I was the overall manager responsible for the development of the Sentencing and Parole Acts and the Victims' Rights Act.
The 2002 Sentencing Act increased the minimum non-parole period to 17 years for murder committed under certain circumstances, including long-term planning, home invasion, or high levels of brutality.
What it does is say any murders that fall into the following categories are the worst murders. When you look at that list, it covers almost everything. Judges are confronted with a 17-year minimum term.
Section 104 doesn't apply, but if it does, then this is such a case where it would be manifestly unjust to impose 17 years, and that Your Honour's really pitching around a 12 to 13-year minimum non-parole. If you can simply tick boxes, why have judges? Because justice is something that none of us can define it. We know it when we see it, we feel it.
This brings me to the sentence to be imposed in the most serious charge, namely that of murder. This was a serious robbery. It involved two men going in the dead of night to a property to steal. When they encountered resistance, severe violence was handed out to the point where the victim died. I consider that those are the type of circumstances that Parliament contemplated would trigger the operation of Section 104. Mr. Nicholson, on the charge of murder, you're sentenced to life imprisonment in order to serve a minimum term of 17 years imprisonment. Thank you, stand by.
Here's a young man, that's a long time. We had hoped for less, but that wasn't to be. Judge thought otherwise, and that's the outcome.
There's been an increasing tendency for the courts to sentence people to longer and longer minimums.
The new Act has had a big effect on the number of years lifers are in prison, and so we now have a growing and ageing prison population.
That obviously dramatically increased the costs of the system and put a great deal of pressure on custodial facilities.
January 2010, the government announced its intention to introduce a version of the US's 3 strikes and you're out policy.
They introduced the ability to give a true life sentence, and that means no parole, ever. Throw away the key. It's only a matter of time till we see an offender who meets that category who is going to get a true life sentence.
Sharia law is one of the options where a victim's family gets to choose the punishment for an offender. They get to choose whether, for example, a convicted murderer themselves gets killed, or whether they accept blood money payoff. It's completely understandable that any victim's family, who are of course, victims themselves, would want, the maximum retribution and punishment possible for that individual. But again, as a society, we have to take into account who we want to be and what we want to reflect.
Can we define what is perfect for an individual? I think not. But certainly, I don't think anyone can quibble with the fact that people need to be punished.
And there is also that aspect of the really serious offenders who need to be locked up to make sure that the rest of us are safe in our homes.
The sentence should be a message to the community that the courts do not tolerate the illegal taking of a life. But on the other hand, there must always be light at the end of the tunnel. There must always be hope, and there must always be dignity.
Next time.
I mean, even Oscar Wilde wrote about this. Each man kills the thing he loves.
Wundering yelled and get away from my woman, and my grandfather get away from my woman.
He jumped out and up with the gun.
Strange thing that love and hate are very closely associated.
He burst into the house and I couldn't stop him because he heard me scream.
I think we all do have the ability to kill, given particular context and circumstances.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.